thought I'd talk about Charles Bukowski, the poet, today, and what I've learned from him over a long time. I was on a tram, pretty drunk, going down Lygon Street, maybe 2005, 2006, and started talking to this girl on the tram, and she invited me back, and we just got drunk and we talking shit, and she showed me Charles Bukowski's poetry, and I never gave a shit about poetry. I didn't care. I guess the closest I ever came to it was through Michael Loonig's work, which is, he has poetic observations, but he's not a poet in a traditional way, but either is Bukowski. And a lot of people will bag out on Bukowski for being not sort of a formalist, traditionalist poet. And he popularized confessional poetry, which is, I did this, I did that, and he always brings it back to a personal level where he's fucked up somehow, but the world is equally as fucked up. He always seems to balance things out in a really interesting way, and sometimes it's almost a little bit like reading a journal of a cartoon character, because he did love sort of self-aggrandizing and talking himself up about how heroic and tough and he was. But the older he got, the more his poetry became a little bit softer and a little bit more almost like a real voice. You could feel, not a real voice, but just something else was breaking through into his mid-60s. Because he started writing poetry at the age of 35. He was writing before that, but he got really shit-faced for 15 years, from 20 to 35, and did write a little bit. But then he went into, between 35 and 50, he was working in a mailroom, and he loved Ezra Pound. I've tried reading Ezra Pound's poetry. He's regarded as a genius, but I find it personally difficult to understand. Or I feel like I need a code breaker to read it while alongside his work. Sometimes a turn of phrase will stand out, but he loved that sort of stuff, and he was writing. He was kind of writing. It was a bit more faluting, I guess, before he was 50, his poetry. But then it started to get more blunt and brutal, and there was nothing to hide behind, nothing fancy to hide behind, and that it was kind of startling, his work. And he talked a lot about booze and sex workers and just, really old school stuff that feels like a foreign country now. I only caught a whiff of it as a kid in the 80s until this new world turned up. And he wrote, what I've learned from him, he'll write about stuff like the darkest thoughts that we might have, but we will never say it, even write it in a diary or anything. Like, he'll talk about evil. He's talked about, he had FBI files on him for publishing stuff in porno magazines that, he would have just been cancelled a billion trillion times today, but he's almost feels like an antidote to current culture. It's beautiful that you can walk into a shop like Readings bookstore in Melbourne and still find his best of sort of stuff in such a quaint bookshop. But I love that he had the courage to say stuff that everyone's thinking but no one's saying. They've been moralised to so much that they don't even have any dark thoughts anymore. And I love the idea that, like, Jung would talk about the shadow self, and he totally pulled the darkness and the lightness together in a lot of his stuff. Nowadays, when you read stuff about lightness, that doesn't feel like it has gravity, or it doesn't feel like it has any realness to a lot of work. I'm saying that really broadly. Yeah, a lot of his stuff was so dark that when he did talk about light, he would kind of in a chiaroscuro way, as the old oil painting masters would really contrast those darks and lights. He does it so well. and all the things that we're not allowed to do or not supposed to talk about, or you're not allowed to have those sorts of opinions, or just against all science, all wisdom. He really just went the other way. He was kind of a contrarian, and a lot of my favourite artists will always take whatever the popular wisdom is of the day, whether it comes from doctors or scientists or theologians or historians or sociologists, and will flip it on its head and try and find the tiny truth in opposition to the popular one. And that tiny truth just feels like such a relief, such a siphon of steam that comes out. It's like popping a huge yellow disgusting pimple until it looks like red and yellow custard on your arm. He wrote a lot of his stuff pissed, pretty much. He'd usually write with beer or red wine. He didn't really write with spirits because he liked the idea that beer, he could write all through the night. He'd get home and save his energy for writing, and he'd go to work the next day and people would tell him that he'd stink like a petrol station. What I get most from him is almost like a sense of Dutch courage. It's like reading his stuff, I feel drunk. You can get drunk off reading his drunken words. And he often said he'd write drunk and then play around with it the next night, editing it still drunk, as opposed to Hemingway's famous quote, which is write drunk, edit sober. And a lot of his work sort of also, I'm sort of scatterbraining this podcast episode, but it revolved around casual references to suicide and death, the beauty of life, and he'd often at some point in his career he'd finish off his poems, almost the punchline would become some sort of piece of nature that he had just observed after talking about all this hellish shit. He detested the left because of its sort of cliquey, bitchy, ingrown, arty, elitist vibe, and he also hated the right for its just sometimes lack of humanity in some areas of life. He sort of stepped outside politics altogether. He thought it was just a piece of shit. But for me, yeah, what I get out of him the most is, I guess it's his sense of courage against popular ideas and opinion, probably the most, and his brutal use of language. There's no mucking around. He just punches you in the face before. There's no sort of, it's not a gentle nihilism. He's already beaten you to the trigger warning. You've already stepped on a landmine before the trigger warning can even come in. I kind of love that. I love that. He'd punch up, yes, but he'd also punch down, I guess you could call it that. If there was truth in punching down, he'd call out bullshit left, right and centre, up, down, left, right, wherever. He just didn't care. He didn't care about the rules. I remember walking home from a 9-to-5 job at one point and thinking, oh my God, this guy makes so much fucking sense. And he'd be talking about drinking and smoking, and I'd sit by the train tracks and I'd have a drink and a smoke with him. It felt like talking to an old friend. Just reading his words, it felt like hanging out with him. Over time, that kind of disappeared, and it feels like a faint shadow now, because I know a lot of his work. I've probably read 90% of it a few times, and I've heard a lot of people outgrow his stuff. Like, it's kind of like a bit of an angsty teenager. I've returned to it over the last 15 years thinking, yeah, I've finally outgrown him, and then go, no, he actually still has some good shit to say. Like, the more I take on life, the more I go, that I've brought a whole new different meaning to what he was saying, because a lot of his stuff he wrote over the age of 50, so he'd lived life. He didn't have to make shit up. He'd already done it. Like, a lot of famous writers are in their 20s and 30s and haven't, they're just kind of bullshit artists who win awards and are very clever. And of course they've lived life as well, but not. Something else happens, I reckon, beyond beyond 50. I'm not quite 50 yet, but a few of my favourite comedians and writers are usually around probably 50 or just older than me. I'm always interested in hearing something from someone who's older than me, even if they, they're not well known or whatever. I always feel like they might have something interesting to say just because they've taken on lots of life and they have the data from simply existing to recognise patterns and see what is going on. His editor, John Martin, once said that he could have been one of the great comedians of his generation, and it's true. I always find myself, I'm reading this really dark shit, and all of a sudden he'll say something. You're not allowed to say it, but he'll just say it. But I was slightly thinking something just dodgy as fuck, and he's just gone out and said it, and even more crazily than I'd imagined it in the first place. But he just, there's humour to it as well. And I know that a lot of people will pick on him and say, he's a piece of shit. If you're dating someone who likes Bukowski, you're in trouble, because I guess that's the popular way. He was kind of part of a generation where, in inverted commas, men were men, and that doesn't exist anymore. And it's true. It's kind of true. Like, whether or not I like to believe that or not, it is true. In that kind of sense, he kind of speaks to human as dumbass animals with instincts to fulfill, and he strips away the layers of who men and women should and shouldn't be, and just strips us back to super basic atavistic reptilian instinct of what the disgusting things that we just are. Not even disgusting. He was kind of self-loathing, but also not. But he just strips humanity away and shows it for what it really is. He often talks about the courage that other authors before him had brought him, and in a way he was living off the borrowed courage of authors that he loved, and also the coward's blood, in his words, of booze. And in some ways I've lived off the borrowed courage of Bukowski and also my favourite authors they overlap in a Venn diagram for sure. Like they're all saying the same sort of thing. They're all crying about the same sort of thing in a good way. Sometimes I wonder what he would say about the current state of culture in the world. And I think he would just say nothing's changed. It just looks like it's changed, but nothing really has. That's what I reckon he would say. Something like that, but way more poetically and with a larger explosion. Something I learned from him was just in terms of writing style and a technique, he hated writing that dawdled on and on. He loved the power of a sentence, and he talks about it in some YouTube clip where he says that each line should carry a delicious little juice. In a way, he was writing memes. His poems were memes, and it's almost how Instagram works now, in that you almost have to catch someone with an explosive, combustible line immediately, and people's brains have been sort of turned into that sort of ADHD, but maybe not. Maybe writing was boring all along, and he sort of was writing memes before they were kind of invented. Whole poems of his were kind of made up of memes in a way. Whole poems of his were almost like highlight reels, each line like a zinger, and the cumulative effect of zinger after zinger it would just make my mind spin, and I'd just breathe a sigh of relief, going, oh my god, the whiplash of too many truths said in a row just made my heart all fluttery and good. Those sorts of poems feel like they add a few years to my life, and I guess that's why I like his stuff. To finish this off, I should read one of my favourite poems of his, and one of my favourite poems of all time. And it's kind of, he wrote it closer to the end of his life, and this is what I regard of more of his softer kind of stuff. And to some people it seems out of character, but I feel like it was always in his character. If you read between the lines of his his more sort of macho shit. But it goes like this. The Laughing Heart by Charles Bukowski. Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them. Take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvellous. The gods wait to delight in you.